Julian Ashcroft checked his gold Rolex, sneering at his wife across the courtroom table. He had everything: the high-powered lawyers, the multi-million-dollar company, and the judge in his back pocket. He looked at Eleanor, a woman he believed was a penniless orphan he'd rescued from mediocrity, and whispered, "You leave with what you came with, Ellie. Nothing." He expected her to cry. He expected her to beg. Instead, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open with a thunderous crash. A man in a charcoal suit walked in, silencing the room. Julian froze. He didn't just see a stranger, he saw the man who owned his debt. He saw his wife's brother. The silence in the dining room of the Ashcroft estate was usually peaceful, a testament to the insulation and triple-paned glass that money could buy. Tonight, however, it felt suffocating. Eleanor sat at the end of the long mahogany table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't eating. Her husband, Julian Ashcroft, was busy slicing into a rare steak, the screech of his knife against the fine china serving as the only conversation. Julian was a handsome man, in the way a statue is handsome, chiseled, cold, and entirely incapable of warmth. As the CEO of Ashcroft Dynamics, a mid-sized logistics firm in Seattle, he had built a reputation for ruthlessness. Unfortunately, he brought that same management style home. "I spoke to Isabella today," Julian said, not looking up from his plate. Isabella was his corporate counsel, and, as Eleanor strongly suspected, his mistress. Eleanor took a steadying breath. "And? Did you finalize the acquisition of the port warehouse?" Julian finally looked up, his eyes narrowing with a mix of pity and annoyance. "We weren't discussing warehouses, Eleanor. We were discussing us." He reached into his jacket pocket and slid a thick manila envelope across the polished wood. It stopped just inches from Eleanor's untouched wine glass. "It's over, Ellie. I'm filing for divorce." The words hung in the air. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't flip the table. She just stared at the envelope. "Divorce?" "Julian, we've been married for 4 years. You were just talking about expanding the house last week." "I was talking about expanding my house," Julian corrected, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "Look, let's not make this messy. You're a nice girl. You are decorative, useful for the charity galas. But let's be honest, you're a former kindergarten teacher with no family, no connections, and no ambition. Ashcroft Dynamics is entering a new tier. I need a partner who understands that world. Isabella understands that world." Eleanor felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. "So it is Isabella. That's irrelevant," Julian waved his hand dismissively. "What is relevant is the prenuptial agreement. You signed it. You leave with what you brought into the marriage." "I brought my life into this marriage, Julian," Eleanor said softly. "I supported you when the board tried to oust you in 2022. I nursed you through that pneumonia when you wouldn't go to the hospital. I designed the interior of this house, which you claim adds 20% to its value." Julian laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Domestic labor, Ellie. Easily replaced. The prenup is ironclad. You get your clothes, your personal items, and your old Honda. The house, the cars, the accounts, the investments, they stay with me. I'm being generous by giving you until the end of the week to vacate." Eleanor stood up slowly. She was wearing a simple grey dress, one he often criticized for being too plain. "You're throwing me out? With nothing? Julian, I don't have any family to go to. You know that." "That," Julian said, standing up to pour himself another glass of wine, "sounds like a you problem. Don't fight me on this, Eleanor. My lawyers will bury you under so much paperwork you won't be able to breathe. Just sign the papers, take the Honda, and go back to wherever you came from." He turned his back to her, dismissing her existence entirely. Eleanor looked at his back, her eyes changing. The softness that usually defined her gaze hardened into something steely, something Julian had never bothered to notice. "You really think I'm worth nothing, don't you?" she asked. "Financially?" Julian chuckled. "Yes. You're a zero, Ellie. A rounding error." Eleanor reached out and picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. "Okay, Julian, if that's how you want to play it." "It's not a game," he sneered. "It's business." "Right," Eleanor whispered as she walked out of the dining room. "Business." The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in humiliation. Julian didn't just want a divorce, he wanted to scorch the earth. He froze their joint checking account, claiming unusual activity when Eleanor tried to buy groceries. He instructed the staff at the manor to stop laundering her clothes. He wanted her to break. He wanted her to beg him for a settlement so he could toss her a few $1,000s like she was a beggar on the street. Eleanor moved into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling Ashcroft estate, with peeling wallpaper and the sound of highway traffic keeping her awake. But she didn't cry. She spent her days on her laptop, making calls. Julian, meanwhile, was living it up. He was seen at high-end restaurants with Isabella Vane, a sharp-featured brunette with a reputation for destroying opponents in court. One afternoon, Eleanor walked into the law offices of Vane and Partners for the preliminary mediation. The conference room was all glass and chrome, overlooking the Seattle skyline. Julian sat at the head of the table, flanked by Isabella and 2 junior associates. Eleanor walked in alone, carrying a worn leather satchel. "You're late," Isabella said, not looking up from her files. "And you're unrepresented. Bold strategy, Mrs. Ashcroft. Or is it Ms. Vance now?" "I don't need a lawyer to tell me what's fair," Eleanor said, taking a seat. Julian sighed theatrically. "Ellie, please, don't embarrass yourself. We're offering you a one-time payment of $10,000. That's enough to get an apartment and restart your little teaching career. Sign and we can all go home." "I want half," Eleanor said, calmly. The room went silent. Then Isabella burst out laughing. "Half?" Isabella smirked. "Half of what? The company? The estate? You have no claim. The prenup? The prenup was signed under duress," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady. "And Julian hid assets, the offshore accounts in the Caymans, the shell company, J. Prime Holdings, in Nevada." Julian's face went pale for a split second before flushing red with rage. "You've been snooping through my office?" "I was your wife, Julian. I paid the bills. I organized the files. Did you think I was too stupid to read?" Julian slammed his fist on the table. "You have no proof. And even if you did, I'll drag this out for years. I'll bankrupt you. You can't afford a lawyer who can go toe-to-toe with Isabella. Who are you going to hire? Some strip mall ambulance chaser." Eleanor opened her satchel and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a letter, printed on thick, cream-colored stationery, with a gold-embossed crest at the top. "I don't need to hire anyone, Julian," Eleanor said. "I'm giving you one last chance. Settle this fairly. Give me what is rightfully mine, 50% of the marital assets, and I will walk away. I won't expose the tax fraud. I won't expose the bribes you paid to the zoning commissioner for the warehouse deal." Isabella leaned forward, her eyes cold. "Is that a threat? That sounds like blackmail." "It's a negotiation," Eleanor replied. Julian stood up, buttoning his jacket. No deal. You get nothing. In fact, I'm taking the $10,000 offer off the table. Now you get 0. See you in court, Eleanor. I hope you enjoy living in your car." He stormed out. Isabella following him with a triumphant smirk. Eleanor sat alone in the conference room. She looked at the letter on the table. The gold crest at the top depicted a lion holding a globe, the seal of Thorn Enterprises. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 7 years. It rang twice. "Hello?" A deep, commanding voice answered. "Sterling," Eleanor said, her voice finally cracking just a little. "It's Ellie." There was a pause on the other end, heavy with years of silence. "Ellie, where are you?" "I'm in Seattle. I made a mistake, Sterling. You were right about him. You were right about everything." "Is he hurting you?" The voice on the line dropped an octave, becoming dangerous. "He's trying to destroy me," Eleanor whispered. "Stay where you are," the man said. "I'm fueling the jet. I'll be there in 4 hours." For Julian Ashcroft, the week leading up to the final divorce hearing felt less like a legal battle and more like a victory lap. With Eleanor out of the house, he had already begun erasing her presence. He hired a high-end interior designer to replace her cozy, rustic aesthetic with modern minimalism, sharp angles, cold steel, and black leather. It looked impressive, but it felt like a showroom, devoid of life. He sat in his corner office at Ashcroft Dynamics, overlooking the Seattle drizzle. The Port Warehouse deal had gone through, thanks to some creative accounting suggested by Isabella, and his stock prices were ticking upward. "You look like the cat who ate the canary," Isabella said, strolling into his office without knocking. She placed a venti coffee on his desk. "Better," Julian smirked, spinning a pen between his fingers. "I feel like the man who finally cut the dead weight. The hearing is tomorrow at 9 a.m. Judge Harrison is presiding. I've played golf with him at the Rainier Club for years. He hates alimony cases. This will be an open and shut dismissal." "And Eleanor?" Isabella asked, sitting on the edge of his desk, crossing her legs. "Any word from her camp?" Silence. Julian laughed. Radio silence. She probably realized she can't afford a lawyer and is too proud to beg. She'll show up, cry a little. Judge Harrison will bang his gavel, and I'll be a free man by lunch. I was thinking we celebrate at Canlis tomorrow night. "I love a man with a plan," Isabella purred. However, beneath Julian's bravado, there were cracks he refused to acknowledge. Since Eleanor left, his home life was in chaos. He missed appointments she used to manage. He lost his favorite cufflinks. The staff, usually loyal, seemed cold and distant. His housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, had actually resigned 2 days ago, muttering something about working for a snake. Julian dismissed it all. He was Ashcroft. He was untouchable. Later that afternoon, Julian received a call from his CFO, Marcus. "Julian, there's some odd movement in the market," Marcus said, sounding nervous. "Define odd," Julian snapped, checking his watch. He had a tailor fitting in 20 minutes. A massive block of our debt was just purchased on the secondary market. We have those 3 bridge loans we took out for the warehouse expansion. They were bundled and sold this morning. "So? Banks sell debt all the time, Marcus. Who bought it?" "That's the thing. It wasn't a bank. It was a private equity firm called Obsidian Capital. I've never heard of them, but they moved fast. They bought the debt at a premium, Julian. That means they wanted it bad." Julian frowned. "Obsidian? Sounds dramatic. Whatever. As long as they don't call the loans early, I don't care who holds the paper. Just keep the stock price up, Marcus. I have a divorce to win tomorrow." He hung up, annoyed by the interruption. He didn't know it then, but that phone call was the sound of the guillotine blade being hoisted up, preparing to drop. That evening, in a luxury suite at the Four Seasons Hotel downtown, far nicer than the motel Eleanor had been staying in, Eleanor stood by the window. She looked different. The grey, shapeless dresses were gone. She wore a tailored navy pantsuit that screamed power. Her hair, usually pulled back in a messy bun, was blown out in sleek waves. Sitting on the velvet sofa behind her was a man who looked like a more dangerous version of Julian. He had broad shoulders, steel grey eyes, and an aura of absolute command. He was typing on a secure satellite phone. "It's done," Sterling Thorne said, setting the phone down. "Obsidian Capital has acquired 85% of Ashcroft Dynamics' outstanding liabilities. Technically, I own his company's mortgage, his warehouse loans, and the lease on his corporate jet." Eleanor turned around, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to buy his debt, Sterling. I just wanted a fair divorce settlement." Sterling stood up and walked over to his sister, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ellie, you ran away from the family 7 years ago because you wanted to find true love with a man who didn't care about the Thorne money. I let you go because I wanted you to be happy. But this man, he treated a daughter of the House of Thorne like a servant. He humiliated you. He doesn't just owe you half. He owes a debt of honor." He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than Julian's car. "Tomorrow isn't a divorce hearing, Ellie," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "It's an execution." The King County Superior courtroom was a drab room filled with the smell of floor wax and stale coffee. Julian Ashcroft sat at the petitioner's table, checking his phone. He looked immaculate in an Italian silk suit. Beside him, Isabella Vane was organizing her files with the precision of a shark organizing its teeth. On the other side of the aisle, Eleanor sat alone. The gallery was mostly empty, save for a few bored clerks and a local reporter who covered high-profile divorces, hoping for a scandal. "All rise," the bailiff droned. Judge Harrison swept in, his black robes billowing. He was an older man with a sour expression and little patience. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the docket. "Ashcroft versus Ashcroft," the judge grunted. "Let's make this quick. I have a 1:00 p.m. tea time." Julian winked at Isabella. It was in the bag. "Your Honor," Isabella began, standing up, "we are here to enforce the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties 4 years ago. Mr. Ashcroft is a successful businessman who has built his empire through tireless work. Miss Vance, formerly Mrs. Ashcroft, brought 0 assets into the marriage and contributed nothing to the business. The prenup clearly states a separation of assets. We are generously offering a $5,000 stipend to help her move, which is more than legally required." Judge Harrison looked at Eleanor. "Miss Ashcroft, you are unrepresented." Eleanor stood up. "I am representing myself for the moment, Your Honor." "Unwise," the judge muttered. "Do you contest the prenup?" "I do," Eleanor said, her voice clear and strong. "It was signed under duress 2 days before the wedding, without independent legal counsel. Furthermore, Mr. Ashcroft has hidden significant marital assets in offshore accounts, specifically in the Cayman Islands under J. Prime Holdings. Because of this fraud, the prenup should be nullified." Julian jumped up. "Objection. She's lying. She has no proof." "Sit down, Mr. Ashcroft," the judge snapped. He turned his eyes to Eleanor, looking skeptical. "Those are serious accusations, young lady. Do you have evidence?" "I have copies of the wire transfers," Eleanor said, reaching for a folder. Isabella cut in smoothly. "Your Honor, these are likely forged or obtained illegally. Eleanor is a desperate woman. She was a kindergarten teacher. She doesn't understand complex finance. She sees a transaction she doesn't understand and cries, 'Fraud.' This is a waste of the court's time. She is simply trying to extort my client." The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Miss Ashcroft, unless you have a forensic accountant here to testify, I am inclined to agree with Ms. Vane. The court recognizes the prenup. I am ruling in favor of the petitioner. You will vacate the marital home immediately and receive the $5,000 stipend." Julian smirked. He turned to Eleanor and mouthed, "Bye-bye, Ellie." "Your Honor," Eleanor said, not moving. "I have one more witness." "Witness?" The judge looked annoyed. "You didn't submit a witness list." "He just arrived," Eleanor said, glancing at the double doors at the back of the room. "This is highly irregular," Isabella argued. "I object. We cannot ambush the court with surprise witnesses." "Deny," the judge started to say. Boom! The heavy oak doors of the courtroom didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that rattled the windows. Every head in the room turned. Standing in the doorway was a phalanx of 4 men in dark suits. They were massive, wearing earpieces, private security, top tier. They stepped aside, creating a corridor. Through that corridor walked Sterling Thorne. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit him like armor. His stride was predatory. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Julian. He looked straight at Eleanor. Behind him trailed 3 more men carrying briefcases. "Who is this?" Judge Harrison demanded, banging his gavel. "This is a closed courtroom. You can't just barge in here." Sterling stopped in the middle of the aisle. He slowly turned his head to look at the judge. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I am not just barging in, Harrison," Sterling said, his voice deep and smooth, carrying to every corner of the room without shouting. "I am the legal counsel for Mrs. Eleanor Thorne Ashcroft." Julian laughed nervously. "Who is this clown? Ellie, did you hire an actor?" Sterling finally looked at Julian. It was the look a lion gives a gazelle that doesn't know it's already dead. "Isabella," Julian whispered, nudging his lawyer. "Do something." Isabella, however, had gone completely pale. Her mouth was slightly open. She recognized the man. She recognized the lapel pin he wore, the crest of the Thorne dynasty. "Your Honor," Isabella stammered, her voice trembling. May we have a recess?" "No recess," Sterling commanded. He signaled to one of his aides who marched forward and slammed a thick binder onto the judge's bench. "What is the meaning of this?" the judge sputtered, looking at the binder. "My name is Sterling Thorne," he announced, "CEO of Thorne Enterprises, and that woman you were about to dismiss with $5,000 is my sister, and the sole heiress to the Thorne Trust." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian blinked, his brain trying to process the information. Thorne Enterprises? The global conglomerate. They owned shipping lines, tech firms, real estate empires. And his wife was a Thorne? "That's impossible," Julian stammered, standing up. "Eleanor Vance. Her name is Vance. She's an orphan from Ohio. She told me she had no family." "I used my mother's maiden name," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the tension. She looked at Julian with pity. "I wanted to be loved for who I was. Julian, not for my checkbook. When we met, I thought you were ambitious and kind. I didn't know the ambition would eat the kindness." "Your Honor," Sterling continued, ignoring Julian's outburst, "the binder in front of you contains not only proof of Mr. Ashcroft's offshore tax evasion, which my forensic team uncovered in less than 12 hours, but also the deed to the property known as Ashcroft Manor." "Excuse me," Julian shouted. "I own that house. I built it." "Actually," Sterling said calmly, "you built it on land, leveraged against a loan from First City Bank, a bank that Thorne Enterprises acquired 3 years ago. You defaulted on the covenants of that loan when you used company funds for personal use, specifically purchasing a diamond bracelet for Miss Vane last month. Sterling gestured to the large screen on the wall used for evidence. One of his aides pressed a button. A receipt flashed up. A Cartier bracelet. $45,000, purchased with the Ashcroft Dynamics corporate card. Isabella gasped and instinctively covered her wrist, where the bracelet currently sat. Fraud, Sterling said. Embezzlement and breach of contract. Julian fell back into his chair. His legs wouldn't hold him. Now, Sterling said, walking toward the petitioner's table. He placed his hands on the wood and leaned in close to Julian. Here is how this is going to go. You wanted a divorce? You've got one. But we are countersuing for emotional distress, fraud, and mismanagement of marital assets. You can't do this, Julian whispered. I have connections. Your connections work for me, Sterling said coldly. He glanced at the judge. Isn't that right, Harrison? I believe your re-election campaign received a generous donation from a PC funded by my subsidiaries. The judge swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Mr. Thorne, this court is strictly impartial. However, this new evidence regarding the, financial irregularities is compelling. Julian, Eleanor spoke up. She hadn't moved from her spot. I don't want your money. Julian looked at her, hope flickering in his eyes. You don't? No, Eleanor said. I have plenty of my own. My trust fund generates more in a month than your company makes in a year. I don't want your house. I don't want your cars. Then what do you want? Julian asked. Eleanor smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I want you to admit it. On the record. Admit you married me because you thought I was weak. Admit you tried to cheat me because you thought I was helpless. Julian looked around the room. The reporter was typing furiously. The judge was glaring at him. Sterling was looming over him like the Grim Reaper. Julian choked. I thought you were nobody. And that, Sterling interrupted, was your fatal error. Sterling straightened up and buttoned his jacket. We are seizing control of Ashcroft Dynamics effective immediately to recoup the debts owed to Obsidian Capital. The board has already been notified. They voted to remove you as CEO 10 minutes ago. Julian's phone buzzed on the table. He looked down. A notification from the Wall Street Journal. Ashcroft Dynamics ousts founder amidst fraud allegations. Stock plummets. You're ruined, Julian, Eleanor said softly. You did it to yourself. Miss Vane, Sterling said, turning his gaze to the lawyer. My team is currently filing a complaint with the Bar Association regarding your complicity in hiding assets. I suggest you find a very good lawyer, though I doubt you'll find one who wants to go up against us. Isabella grabbed her briefcase and bolted from the room without a word, leaving Julian alone. Judge, Sterling said, my sister would like to grant the divorce. She waives all rights to alimony. She waives all rights to the Ashcroft assets, what little is left of them. Judge Harrison banged the gavel so hard it almost cracked. Divorce granted. Assets remain with Mr. Ashcroft, pending the, corporate insolvency proceedings. Court adjourned. The judge practically ran out of the room. Julian sat in the empty courtroom, the silence deafening. He had kept his house and his car, technically, but his company was gone. His reputation was incinerated, and the debts he owed were now called in by a man who hated him. Eleanor walked over to him one last time. She placed her wedding ring on the table. It was a modest diamond, one he had bought when he was still trying to be a good man. Goodbye, Julian, she said. She turned and took Sterling's arm. Let's go home, Ellie, Sterling said, his voice softening instantly as he looked at his sister. Yes, she said. Let's go. As they walked toward the heavy doors, Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "I loved you. In the beginning, I loved you." Eleanor stopped. She didn't turn around. "No, Julian," she said. "You loved owning me. There's a difference." She walked out, the doors swinging shut behind her, leaving Julian Ashcroft in the wreckage of his own arrogance. 6 months had passed since the doors of the courtroom slammed shut on Julian Ashcroft's life. In the world of high finance, blood is in the water for only a moment before the sharks finish the meal. Julian had been devoured. Sterling Thorne wasn't satisfied with simply taking the company. He ensured Julian was radioactive. Every resume Julian sent out was met with silence. Every old friend he called suddenly had a meeting to run to. Julian sat in a cramped studio apartment in a rougher part of Seattle. The wallpaper was peeling, a grim echo of the motel Eleanor had once been forced into. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he lacked the grace to accept it. He adjusted his tie in the cracked bathroom mirror. It was his last good suit, the only one he hadn't sold to pay rent. Tonight was his Hail Mary. He had read in the Seattle Times that the Thorne Foundation was hosting its annual Winter Solstice Gala at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. Tickets were $5,000 a plate. Julian didn't have a ticket, but he still knew the catering manager from his old life. He called in a favor, begging for a shift as a waiter. It was humiliating, but he needed FaceTime. He had convinced himself of a delusion. If Eleanor just saw me, if she saw how much I've suffered, she'd take me back. She's soft. She's a kindergarten teacher at heart. She fixes broken things. He arrived at the hotel, entering through the service entrance. The kitchen was chaotic. "Ashcroft, you're on champagne duty. Trays up, chin up. Don't look the guests in the eye unless spoken to," the floor manager barked. Julian swallowed his pride, grabbing a silver tray filled with crystal flutes. He walked out into the ballroom. It was a world he used to rule. Chandeliers dripped with light. A live orchestra played Debussy. The room was filled with Seattle's elite, tech moguls, politicians, old money. And there she was. Eleanor stood near the center of the room, but she was unrecognizable from the woman he had discarded. She wore a gown of emerald silk that hugged her figure, her hair cascading in loose waves over her shoulders. She was laughing at something a handsome man in a tuxedo was saying. Julian felt a sharp pang of jealousy. He moved through the crowd, his heart pounding. He needed to get close. He needed a moment. He watched as Isabella Vane, his former mistress and lawyer, entered the room on the arm of a rival CEO. Julian froze. He approached her, forgetting his place. "Isabella," he whispered. Isabella turned, looking down at his uniform. Her eyes widened, then narrowed into slits of amusement. "Julian, oh my God, are you serving drinks?" "I need to talk to you. You abandoned me," Julian hissed, the tray shaking in his hand. "I survived, darling," she laughed, grabbing a glass of champagne from his tray. "You were a sinking ship. I just took the lifeboat. Now run along. You're blocking the view." She turned her back on him. Julian's face burned hot with shame. He stumbled away, nearly dropping the tray. He looked back toward Eleanor. She was moving toward the balcony for some fresh air. This was his chance. He ditched the tray on a side table and followed her out into the cold night air. "Ellie?" She turned around. The smile dropped from her face, replaced not by anger, but by a calm, distant curiosity. "Julian," she said. She didn't sound scared. She sounded bored. "Ellie, please." Julian stepped forward, his hands open. "Look at me. I've lost everything. The company, the house, my reputation. I'm living in a shoebox. I'm working as a waiter at your party." "I see that," Eleanor said, glancing at his uniform. "It's honest work, Julian. You should be proud. It's more honest than what you did as a CEO." "I made a mistake," Julian's voice cracked. tears welling up in his eyes. Some real, some manufactured. I let my ambition blind me. But I miss you, not the money. I miss us. I miss the way you used to make coffee in the morning. I miss your laugh. Please, Ellie, give me a second chance. I can sign a post-nup. I'll do anything. Just take me back. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant sound of traffic and the muffled orchestra. You miss the coffee, Eleanor repeated softly. You miss the domestic labor. You don't miss me, Julian. You miss having a fan. No, Stop, she said, raising a hand. You think you're being punished because I'm angry. You think Sterling destroyed you out of spite. But you did this. You built your house on sand, Julian. You cheated, you lied, and you treated people like disposables. The wind blew and your house fell down. That's not karma. That's physics. I can change, Julian begged, dropping to his knees on the cold concrete of the balcony. Please, Ellie, I have nowhere else to go. The glass doors behind them opened. Sterling Thorne stepped out. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man taking out the trash. Is there a problem here, Miss Thorne? Sterling asked, ignoring Julian completely. No problem, Sterling, Eleanor said, looking down at her ex-husband. Just a ghost from the past. Security is on the way, Sterling noted dryly. Julian scrambled to his feet. You can't do this. I was someone in this city. Keyword. Was, Sterling said. Eleanor reached into her clutch. Julian thought for a second she might pull out a checkbook. Instead, she pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I actually have something for you, Julian, she said. I was going to mail it, but this saves a stamp. She handed it to him. What is this? Julian asked, his hands trembling. Open it, she said. Julian unfolded the paper. It was a flyer, a grand opening announcement. The Eleanor Vance Center for Early Childhood Development. Location, 1400 Skyline Drive. Julian gasped. 1400 Skyline Drive was the address of Ashcroft Manor. His dream house. You bought my house, Julian whispered. I bought the bank-owned foreclosure, Eleanor corrected. We gutted it. That cold, modern interior you loved. It's gone. It's full of colors now, Julian. It's full of laughing children who have nowhere else to go. We turned the wine cellar into a library. Your office is now the art room. She stepped closer, her voice soft but lethal. I took the symbol of your greed and turned it into a home for those with nothing. That is my closure. The crystal chandeliers of the Fairmont's grand ballroom didn't just sparkle. They seemed to mock Julian Ashcroft. Every refraction of light was a reminder of a world he had been forcibly ejected from. The air smelled of expensive perfume, roasting prime rib, and the crisp metallic scent of old money, a scent Julian had once worn like a second skin. Now he smelled like industrial laundry detergent and anxiety. Julian adjusted the collar of his stiff, white waiter's uniform. It was a size too small, pinching his neck, a constant physical reminder of his reduced station. He stood near the service entrance, a silver tray of champagne flutes balanced precariously in his hand. His knuckles were white. He wasn't supposed to be here. In fact, if the floor manager, a man named Henderson, who used to valet Julian's Porsche, knew who he was, Julian would have been escorted out the back door. But Julian had shaved his signature beard, lost 20 pounds from stress and a diet of instant noodles, and aged 10 years in 6 months. He was a ghost. "Tray up, newbie," a passing server hissed, bumping Julian's shoulder. "You're not paid to stare at the guests." Julian swallowed the bile rising in his throat. "I used to tip people like you $100 just to get my car faster," he thought. But he said nothing. He couldn't afford to. He needed this shift. His rent in the basement studio apartment in Bremerton was 3 days late, and his landlord was a man who didn't believe in grace periods. But money wasn't the only reason he had begged for this shift. He knew she would be here. The Winter Solstice Gala was the premier event of the Seattle social calendar, hosted annually by the Thorn Foundation. And tonight, Eleanor was the guest of honor. Julian moved into the crowd, weaving through the tuxedos and designer gowns. He felt invisible. It was a strange, suffocating sensation. 6 months ago, entering a room like this would have caused a gravitational shift. Heads would turn. Men would approach him to talk about shipping yields. Women would look at him with hungry eyes. Now they looked through him. He was furniture. He was a delivery mechanism for alcohol. And then the crowd parted near the center of the room, and Julian forgot how to breathe. Eleanor stood beneath the central chandelier. If Julian had thought she was beautiful before, he realized now that he had been looking at a flower kept in the dark. Now, she was in full bloom. She wore a gown of deep emerald velvet that cascaded to the floor, off the shoulder, revealing skin that glowed under the warm lights. Around her neck was a simple diamond pendant, far smaller than the gaudy jewelry Julian used to force her to wear. Yet it looked infinitely more expensive because she wore it with confidence. She was laughing. It was a sound Julian hadn't heard in years, a genuine throaty laugh that reached her eyes. She was holding a glass of sparkling water, listening to a tall man with salt and pepper hair who looked like a senator. Julian felt a surge of possessiveness so hot it almost made him drop the tray. "She's mine," his mind screamed. "She's my wife, my creation." He needed to get to her. He had convinced himself of a narrative that played on a loop in his lonely apartment. Eleanor is confused. Her brother forced her into this. She's a simple girl at heart. She hates this glitz. If I can just look her in the eye, if I can just remind her of the Sunday mornings we used to spend reading the paper, she'll crack. She'll save me. He moved closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Champagne, sir?" he muttered to a guest, stepping around him to get closer to the inner circle. He was 10 feet away when he saw Isabella Vane. His former mistress and lawyer looked sharp as ever, in a red dress that looked like a wound. She was hanging on to the arm of Marcus, Julian's former CFO, the man who had betrayed him to the board. They were clinking glasses, smiling like sharks. Julian froze. The betrayal tasted like copper in his mouth. Isabella turned, her eyes scanning the room for the next person to charm. Her gaze landed on the waiter. She paused. Her eyes narrowed. Recognition dawned, followed immediately by a look of pure, unadulterated amusement. She leaned in and whispered something to Marcus. Marcus looked at Julian, smirked, and shook his head. They didn't even come over to gloat. That was the ultimate insult. He wasn't even worth mocking anymore. Julian turned away, his face burning. He looked back at Eleanor. She was excusing herself from the group, moving toward the French doors that led to the terrace. "Now." Julian ditched his tray on a side table, ignoring the crash of a glass tipping over. He smoothed his hair and followed her. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and pine. The terrace was empty, save for Eleanor, who was leaning against the stone balustrade, looking out at the city lights of Seattle. She didn't turn around when the door opened. "It's a beautiful view," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. He tried to summon the commanding baritone he used to use in boardrooms, but it came out thin and desperate. Eleanor stiffened. She didn't gasp. She didn't run. She simply turned around slowly, placing her glass on the stone railing. "Hello, Julian," she said. Her voice was calm, unnervingly calm. "You knew it was me?" he asked, stepping closer. "I smelled your cologne." she said dryly. Sandalwood and desperation. You never did know when to change scents. I wanted to see you, Ellie. Don't call me that, she said. It wasn't a shout. It was a correction, like a teacher speaking to a slow child. That was the name you gave your pet. My name is Eleanor. Eleanor, Julian corrected, taking another step. He opened his arms, a gesture meant to be welcoming, but in his ill-fitting waiter's uniform, he just looked like he was begging for a tip. Look at me. Look at what they did to me. Eleanor looked him up and down. Her gaze was clinical. I see you're working. That's good, Julian. Honest labor builds character. Isn't that what you used to tell the warehouse workers when you cut their overtime? Julian winced. I've lost everything. The company is gone. Sterling gutted it, sold off the assets, and absorbed the logistics contracts. I have nothing. I'm living in a basement in Bremerton. I take the ferry every morning at 4 a.m. just to scrub dishes or serve drinks to people I used to employ. He fell to his knees. The damp concrete soaked instantly into his cheap trousers. I'm sorry, he choked out. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I was blind. I was arrogant. But I've paid for it. Haven't I paid enough? I miss you. I miss the house. I miss us. Eleanor watched him kneel. She took a sip of her water. You miss the house, she repeated. Interesting order of priorities. You miss the house, then you miss us. I built that house for you, Julian lied, the tears flowing freely now. Every brick was a testament to my love. You built that house to impress your father's ghost, Eleanor said. I was just the prop you placed in the living room to make it look lived in. No, that's not true. Please just take me back. We can start over. I have ideas, Eleanor. I have business plans. If I just had a little capital, a small loan from your trust, I could rebuild. We could be a power couple. The way we were meant to be. Eleanor sighed. It was a sound of profound exhaustion. Get up, Julian. You're embarrassing yourself. Not until you forgive me. I forgave you months ago, she said. Julian's head snapped up, hope flooding his face. You did? Yes. Holding on to hate is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I let the hate go. Now I feel nothing when I look at you. You're just a stranger with a familiar face. The glass doors slid open behind them. Sterling Thorne stepped out. He was wearing a tuxedo that cost more than Julian's former car. He didn't look angry. He looked at Julian with the mild annoyance one might have for a stray dog that wandered onto the porch. Security is on the way, Eleanor, Sterling said quietly. Do you need me to remove him myself? No, Eleanor said. She opened her clutch, a small, silver thing. He was just leaving, but I have something for him first. Julian stood up, wiping his eyes. Money? Are you giving me a check? Eleanor pulled out a folded piece of heavy cardstock. It was a brochure. She handed it to him. Consider this your closure, Julian, she said. Julian took the brochure. His hands shook as he opened it. It was a glossy pamphlet for a grand opening. The front cover featured a photo of a large, familiar estate. The sprawling lawns, the limestone columns, the triple-paned windows, Ashcroft Manor. But the sign in the front yard didn't say Ashcroft. It read, The Eleanor Vance Refuge for Women and Children. Julian stared at the image. You still have the house? I bought the foreclosure from the bank after you defaulted, Eleanor explained, her voice gaining a sharp, triumphant edge. Sterling wanted to bulldoze it. He said it had bad energy, but I had a better idea. She pointed a manicured finger at the photo in the brochure. You see that window? The one on the second floor? That was your master suite. The room where you locked yourself in to call your mistress. The room where you told me I was worthless. Julian nodded dumbly. It's a nursery now, Eleanor said. We painted it yellow. It sleeps 6 toddlers who have been removed from abusive homes. The silence you loved so much, it's gone. That room is filled with laughter and crying and life. She pointed to the west wing. Your wine cellar? The one with the 5,000-odd vintage reds you wouldn't let me touch? We drained the wine. It's a food pantry now. It holds formula, canned goods, and blankets for mothers who ran away with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Julian felt like he had been punched in the gut. You turned my palace into a homeless shelter? I turned your mausoleum into a sanctuary, she corrected. I took the symbol of your greed, a house built to keep people out, and turned it into a place that welcomes everyone in. She stepped closer, so close he could see the gold flecks in her eyes. You told me to leave with nothing, Julian. Do you remember? You said I was a zero. Well, I took that, nothing, and I built something real. And the best part? The plaque by the front door dedicates the building to all the women who survived, men like Julian Ashcroft. Julian crumpled. The architectural legacy he thought would immortalize his name was now a monument to his cruelty. Go, Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave, before I throw you off this balcony. Julian backed away. He clutched the brochure to his chest like a shield. He stumbled through the service door, down the back stairs, and out into the alleyway where the dumpsters sat. He sat on a wet crate, the rain beginning to fall, soaking his white waiter's jacket until it was translucent. He looked at the brochure one last time. The house looked beautiful, brighter than it had ever looked when he owned it. He realized then that the house had never rejected Eleanor. It had rejected him. The town of Orofino, Idaho, was a gray place in the winter. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, and the snow turned to slush the moment it hit the pavement. Julian Ashcroft sat in the corner booth of Sal's Diner, a greasy spoon on the edge of the highway. He was 45, but he looked 60. His hair was thinning and grey, his face lined with the deep grooves of a man who frowned in his sleep. He wore a blue work uniform with a patch that said, Julian, shift supervisor. He managed a loading dock for a regional trucking company. It was logistics, technically, but instead of moving millions of dollars of tech across the Pacific, he was shouting at teenagers to load pallets of fertilizer onto rusty trucks. He had no wife. He had no children. He had a one-bedroom apartment above a bowling alley where the rumble of the lanes kept him up until midnight. More coffee, hun? The waitress, a kind woman named Barb, asked. Please, Julian rasped. He stared into the black liquid. It was bitter, but it was hot. Above the counter, a small television was playing the national news. Julian usually tuned it out, preferring the silence of his own regrets. But a familiar melody caught his ear. A piano piece. Debussy. The same song the orchestra had played that night at the Fairmont. He looked up. The screen showed a sweeping drone shot of a massive estate in Seattle, covered in snow, twinkling with thousands of Christmas lights. And finally tonight, the anchor smiled. A story of hope. The Eleanor Vance Refuge is celebrating its 5th anniversary. Since opening its doors, the center has helped over 1,000 families transition from crisis to stability. Julian's hand shook. He put the coffee cup down. The camera cut to a press conference. There she was, Eleanor. She looked older, but in the way fine wine ages. Deeper, richer. She wore a thick wool coat and a scarf. She was holding the hand of a little girl, maybe 4 years old, who was hiding behind her legs. Standing next to Eleanor was a man. He wasn't Sterling. He was tall, wearing a simple flannel shirt and a parka. He had a kind face, the kind of face that smiled easily. He had his arm around Eleanor's waist, a gesture of easy, comfortable protection. "Mrs. Thorne Mitchell?" a reporter asked. "What is your message to those watching who feel like they've hit rock bottom?" Eleanor looked into the camera. Her eyes were fierce. "Rock bottom is just a foundation," she said. "I was once told that I had no value, that I should leave with nothing, but I learned that nothing is just a blank page. You can write whatever you want on it. To anyone watching who feels worthless, you are the architect of your own future. Don't let anyone else hold the blueprints." The camera zoomed out. The little girl tugged on Eleanor's hand, and Eleanor bent down to pick her up, kissing her cheek. The husband laughed and kissed Eleanor's temple. They looked impenetrable, a fortress of happiness. The segment ended. The screen cut to a commercial for car insurance. Julian sat in the diner, the silence around him deafening despite the clatter of silverware. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. He saw a man who had traded love for leverage and ended up with neither. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet to pay. Tucked in the back fold, worn soft as fabric from years of touching, was the corner of that old brochure. The Eleanor Vance Refuge. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, with a shaking hand, he pulled it out. He walked over to the trash can by the door. He hovered his hand over it. He realized that keeping it was just another form of vanity, a way to pretend he was still part of her story. But he wasn't. He was just the prologue she had torn out. He dropped the scrap of paper into the trash. "Keep the change, Barb," Julian said softly. He buttoned his coat and walked out into the cold Idaho night. The wind bit at his face, but he didn't flinch. He just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, disappearing into the grey, snowy dark, a man who had finally learned the cost of everything and the value of nothing. Wow. Just wow. That ending hits hard, doesn't it? Julian spent his whole life trying to build an empire, only to end up watching his wife build a legacy of love in the very house he used to control. It's the ultimate karmic justice. He wanted to be a king, but he ended up exiled in the snow, while the queen of nothing saved the kingdom. I think the most powerful moment was Eleanor turning the wine cellar into a food pantry, taking his selfishness and turning it into selflessness. It really shows that the best revenge isn't anger, it's success and kindness. What did you guys think of Julian's fate? Did he deserve to be alone in that diner, or did you feel a tiny bit of pity for him at the end? And what would you have done if you were Eleanor on that balcony? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps get these stories to more people. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications. I have an even crazier revenge story coming up next week that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and be kind.